2.
Afternoon and morning in New York and the Americas. Good evening in Kiev and Europe. And welcome whatever time of day or night for all who are joining us from all corners of the world. I'm Yael Danieli, founder and executive director of the International Center for the Study, Prevention, and Treatment of Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma, ICMGLT for short. Thank you for joining our webinar today. Before we begin, let me acknowledge with deep gratitude and appreciation the dedicated contribution of Dr. Irina Frankova, chair of the ICMGLT Working Group on Ukraine, without whom this event would not have taken place. And as always, we are grateful to our superb interpreters, Anya Stempkovska and Natalia Zayets. It is now my great pleasure to introduce you to our moderator for today's webinar, Dr. Veronika Plotnikova. She's head of the Coordination Center for the Support of Victims and Witnesses of the Prosecutor General's Office in Ukraine. Veronika has been working in the Prosecutors Institution system for over 15 years, leading the specialized unit for implementing human rights standards into the prosecutor services. She co-authored the practical commentary on the Code of Professional Ethics of Prosecutors, is a trainer in the Training Center of Prosecutors of Ukraine, and national experts of projects of Council of Europe. Veronika.
Thank you, Yael, for such a brilliant introduction. And it's a great pleasure for me to be a moderator on our event. So I want to say a few words about our webinar. So today, International Center for the Study, Prevention, and Treatment of Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma webinar series is held in collaboration with Project Sunflowers. It's not the first, but the third in our series, following first webinar about conceptual introduction to reparative justice, and the second one about key groups of traumatized victims, where I had an honor to be a presenter. So today's webinar will focus on elements of such an issue as a conspiracy of silence, harmful both to the victims and society. When, on the other hand, society has a moral obligation to share its members' pain, on the other hand, professionals and investigators have, in addition, a professional, special obligations. When we fail to listen, explore, understand, and help, we too inflict the trauma after the trauma, or the second injury to victims, by maintaining the conspiracy of silence. Our webinar will report and elaborate on findings detailing to the multiple ways professional listening is compromised and its implication to reparative justice. So our presenter for today is a brilliant, honorable Dr. Yael Danieli. She is a clinical psychologist, victimologist, pioneer traumatologist, and psychohistorian. She is establisher of the first program to help Nazi Holocaust survivors and their children, and devoted much of her career to studying, treating, writing about, and preventing, first of all, long and multi-generational impacts of massive trauma to victims' rights, to rights of future generations, and to reparative justice. Reparative justice, justice that views the justice process not only the outcomes, but the moment to moment and the totality of the relationships of the justice system with the victims, as offering opportunities for and is experienced by the victims as healing and repair. And also today, our discutant is Yuri Belousov. We will talk about him later. And I'm ready to give a floor to you. Yeah, I offer you, and we are welcome. And dear participants, I want to tell you more about some technical issues. Please, when you, if you want to use your interpreter tracks, please, on your screens on Zoom, you have to choose these three dots where you will see this word more. And here on this part more, you have to choose interpretation. And if you will use English, you will use a track of English. And if you want to hear Ukrainian, you will choose part of Ukrainians. So yeah, sorry for this delay on 1 minute. And now I have a great pleasure to offer the screen to you, Dr. Yael Danieli.
Thank you very much, Veronica. It's such a delight to have you as our moderator today. And certainly total gratitude to having Yuri as a discussion. The jewels in the crown of reparative justice are victims' rights. Their rights for protection, including psychological, to participation, that is, to their voice, needs, and concerns being fully heard in a safe, respectful, and dignified environment, and to reparation for their suffering to be redressed. Victims also have the right to truth. They want and need to know what happened, how it happened, why, by whom, to whom. They need the validation and coherence of their and their loved ones' experiences. Being heard, particularly in a reparative relationship, assumes the genuine listening of a fully present, empathic other. In the case of reparative justice, that of the justice professional. Genuine or empathic listening is thus a necessary condition for realizing victims' rights. Yet, throughout history, what victims, survivors of atrocity crimes or massive trauma have nearly uniformly reported is of the overwhelmingly pervasive sociocultural silence about their victimization experiences. They have also told us of the isolation, loneliness, betrayal, and demoralization and suffering they, their families, communities, and succeeding generations feel as a result of this trauma after the trauma, or the second wound, the one that forced their bitter choice to live in silence about their most painful experiences, that stamped the conspiracy of silence. As Terence DePrey observed, as a witness, the survivor is both sought and shunned. The desire to hear his truth is countered by the need to ignore him. Too close a knowledge of vulnerability, of evil, of human insufficiency is felt to be ruinous. The ostracism of outsiders or bearers of bad news, as we feel compelled to defend a comfortable view of life. We tend to deny the survivor's voice. We join a conspiracy of silence. He wrote this in 1976. In the medical psychiatric settings, William Nederland similarly noted, insofar as it cannot be true, a kind of tacit agreement is reached between the patient and doctor, an agreement to gloss over and thereby ignore the potential traumatic data in a flight from horror on the part of the psychotherapist. Deeply affected by and needing to understand this doubly unjust victim-survivor's burden of pain and aloneness, I set out to systematically study the elements of the societal and professional conspiracy of silence, its origins, meaning, and aftermath. I was motivated by my realization that whereas society has a moral obligation to share its members' pain, psychotherapists and researchers have, in addition, a professional contractual obligation. When we fail to listen, explore, understand, and help, we too inflict the trauma after the trauma by maintaining and perpetuating the conspiracy of silence. I also believe that studying the reactions of experienced, well-analyzed, introspective mental health professionals, those who are trained to observe and listen both to their patients and to themselves, would provide insight into other professionals, the larger societal and bystanders conspiracy of silence. Just to clarify, I use the term countertransference, the technical psychoanalytic term. When I say it, it's commonly used to describe therapists' own emotional reactions and difficulties experienced when working with traumatized populations. Today, I discuss the major findings of a study which systematically examined the nature of the emotional responses and other problems experienced by psychotherapists working with Holocaust survivors and their children. Participants in the study were 61 psychotherapists, 40 women and 21 men, with 4 to 40 years of experience. Within this group, 28 were social workers, 23 were psychologists, and 10 were psychiatrists. 50 had completed postgraduate training, and all but one had undergone psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic psychotherapy. In the content analysis of those countertransferent themes, right, the emotional and difficulties, I relied most heavily upon the existing literature and the participants' self-observations. 49 countertransferent themes were generated from interviews. We have 49 ways of not listening. These themes and the number of therapists in the study who mentioned each theme at least once are outlined in the original study. It's important, you can all receive it by request. It's available, it's published. We had judges statistically inter-rater reliability for the 49 themes across the 60 participants ranged from 0.94 to 1, which is extremely high. Let me now map for you those countertransference themes. The most frequent is defense. Let me explain. the various modes of defense, right, against listening to Holocaust experience and against therapists' inability to contain their intense emotional reactions. You see, so there are two issues here. One is the listening, the hearing the content, and the other, the intense emotional reactions, right? Too much. So the various modes of defense comprise the most frequent phenomenon repeatedly reported by psychotherapists and researchers in working with survivors and their children. Some reacted with disbelief and accused the patient of exaggerating. Therapists reported a variety of avoidance reaction. They kept forgetting, turning off, tuning out, and getting bored with the same story over and over again. I'm quoting. Many used distancing. They listened to the stories as though they were science fiction stories, or as if it happened 5,000 years ago. Others became very abstract, professional, and intellectual, frequently lecturing the patient. An extreme cutting off the Holocaust out behavior on the part of psychotherapists was to refer the children of survivors to therapists in the group project for Holocaust survivors and their children, quotes, to take care of the Holocaust part, while continuing to see them, quote, for the rest of their personality problems. Some psychotherapists defended themselves by over-reliance on available method theories, theoretical jargon, and prescribed roles. They used theoretical rationalization, such as, let's talk about the here and now. The past is gone. There's no sense in complaining. You're in the whatever, United States or Israel or France or whatever now. Some stated that, quotes, the children were born here. They behave just like typical, wherever you are, Americans. This is just narcissism. At other times, they focus exclusively on the survivor's pre-Holocaust childhood. The latter is especially true of classical psychoanalysts. For example, Zetzel in 1970 states, external events, no matter how overwhelming, precipitate a neurosis only when they touch on specific unconscious conflict. This avoidance rendered such therapists unable to consider Holocaust traumata as etiologically significant and often central to the understanding of their patient's psychodynamics. In many cases, this omission led to a misinterpreted etiology or understanding of developing history. In many cases, this omission led to misinterpreted etiology, as I said, one that is circumscribed the therapist's understanding and therefore their therapeutic activity to their familiar psychodynamic orientation. In supervision, one therapist described a patient, Mr. S, whose presenting problem was compulsive showering and scrubbing, which resulted in severe damage to his skin. The therapist worked under the assumption that Mr. S's symptomatology was a manifestation of an anal fixation in childhood, right? For those of you who remember anything about psychoanalysis, and kept probing into the childhood. An old intake report stated, in Auschwitz, Mr. S worked for 10 to 12 hours a day, without mention of the nature of his work. Following the supervisor's suggestion, I happened to be the supervisor then, to explore the nature of the patient's work detail, simply asking, what did you do? The therapist learned that Mr. S removed corpses from the crematorium. His father's corpse was one of them. This information served as a breakthrough for both therapist and patient and resulted in a dramatic reduction of the symptom. Whereas all psychological phenomena are overdetermined, right? They have many meanings. It seems clear in this case that the dramatic result here was related to reviewing the patient's Holocaust experience. The distortion caused by insufficient understanding of the meaning and function of the experience of survivor's guilt, about which we will have a special webinar. But today I present just in this context. So the distortion of that is one of the most poignant instances how extraordinary human experience exposes the limits of traditional psychological or other professional theories of conventional life. The pervasiveness of bystander's guilt among psychotherapists and researchers described below may account for their overuse, stereotypic attribution, and reductionistic misinterpretation of concepts such as survivor's guilt as a major feature of the survivor's experience, whose central meanings and functions and related behaviors psychotherapists may miss by responding in the ways described here. Bystander's guilt, indeed, is the most common of the affective or emotional reactions therapists reported in their work with survivors and their children. It is experienced this way. I feel an immense sense of guilt because I led a happy and protected childhood, while these people have suffered so much. Therapists who felt guilty were much more fearful of hurting the patient and used guilt to explain their avoidance of asking questions. I hope that there are hundreds of you with us in the audience today, in all your professions. When I talk about therapists, try to think of your own profession as well. Okay, you will gain more this way. Sorry for mentioning it only now. So let me say that again. Therapists who felt guilty were much more fearful of hurting the patient and used guilt to explain the avoidance of asking questions. Merely asking a question they feared would hurt the patient, quote, who have suffered so much already. Some therapists who felt guilty were also afraid that survivors were fragile, that they would fall apart, overlooking the fact that these were people who had not only survived, but also had rebuilt families and lives despite immense losses and traumatic experiences. Therapists also tended to attribute fragility to survivors' offspring. Such therapists tended to do too much for the survivors and their children to the point of patronizing them and not respecting their strength. Guilt often resulted in the therapist's inability to set reasonable limits, not wanting to hear stories or adopting a masochistic position in relation to the survivor. In some instances, the survivors of the offspring were allowed to call any time, day or night. Therapists also felt guilty in reaction to their own rage at these individuals. Some therapists stopped exploring the patient's problem when they saw tears in their eyes, despite the fact that tears are a perfectly appropriate reaction. Therapists reported feeling guilty for using survivors as subjects. Researchers, lawyers too, reported feeling guilty for using survivors as subject for the study, and then trying to put such human suffering into a, quote, cold, objective scientific design. Some therapists fear that demonstrating the long-term negative effect of the Holocaust was tantamount to giving Hitler a posthumous victory. In contrast, others feared that demonstrating these individual strengths was equivalent to saying that because people could adapt, quotes, it couldn't have been such a terrible experience. And it is almost anonymous with forgiving the Nazis. Elsewhere, I have proposed that survivor's guilt in part serves as a defense against the total helplessness and passivity experienced during the Holocaust. We will have a different webinar on that. The bystander's guilt of therapists also appears as a defense when they experience their helplessness to undo the long-term consequences of the Holocaust for their patients. The pervasiveness of bystanders' guilt among psychotherapists may account for their tendency to overuse stereotypic attributions and reductionistic misinterpretation of concepts such as identification with the aggressor and survivor guilt. The pervasiveness and misuse in application of the concept of survivor's guilt in the treatment of survivors led Carmeli, herself a survivor social worker, to divide it into two categories, passive guilt and active guilt. Passive guilt, the one actually meant by Nederland when he coined the term survivor's guilt, is experienced by those who survived, quote, merely because they happened to be alive at the time of liberation. Active guilt stems from having committed immoral acts and or knowingly having chosen not to help when one could possibly have done so. Asserting that the greatest majority of concentration camp survivors are passive guilt carrier, Carmeli notes that therapists have interpreted hostile, aggressive, and depressive symptoms of survivors as a direct result of unrelieved active guilt feelings, out of their mistaken belief that any survivors must have committed immoral acts. As a result of the focus and the relief of active guilt feelings, which do not exist in reality, these patients have not been helped to relate constructively to their present life. Instead, they develop distorted guilt feelings, and their already painful life might become more drastically painful. Again, we will have a special webinar on this, so I will continue with other reactions. Rage. Rage with its variety of objects is the most intense and one of the most difficult affective reactions experienced by therapists in working with survivors and their children. They often reported that they became enraged listening to Holocaust stories and were overwhelmed by the intensity of their own reactions. Nazi Germany created a reality far worse than any fantasy normally available to the human psyche. But the Nazis are not present as targets for bystanders' rage, and thus the survivors or their offspring may become the symbol of the Holocaust in its totality, available for displacement of these feelings. Survivors remind therapists of their own anger and destructiveness. Some therapists accused victims of bringing the Holocaust upon themselves. This appears to be a rationalization of this displaced anger. Other clinicians were seriously distressed by the conflict between feeling angry towards survivors and the meaning they attributed to this anger. How can I get angry with this person who has already suffered the abuse of the Nazis? That makes me a Nazi. This tendency to identify with the aggressor also contributed to the therapist's fear of further harming their patients and could lead to a cycle of rage and guilt. This pattern seemed to be intensified by compliant and sometimes masochistic behavior of survivors with regard to authorities in general and doctors in particular. You remember Mengele, yeah? As previously noted, guilt often rendered the therapist unable to set limits and then led to conscious or unconscious resentment when patients became more demanding. During the war, being separated meant total and permanent loss. When separation issues are addressed, especially in family therapy, therapists are often confronted with the family's perception of them as Nazis. When therapists over-identify with the child's rebellious rage against parental clinging, they, quote, victimize the parents. The latter behavior may be further abetted by the general tendency among mental health professionals to blame parents for their children's problems. Some therapists call survivors' parents Nazis when they describe parents' interaction with their offspring. When they over-identified with the parents' anxiety and hurt at the child attempted separation, they tended to inhibit the child's normal anger by lecturing the child to, quote, understand the parents who have suffered enough. This dilemma may induce helpless rage in therapists who often reported experiencing murderous feelings towards, quote, these parents or these children. Therapists resorted to counter rage in three major instances. One, in response to being viewed by survivors or their offspring as Nazis, which for the therapist among you, it's a very important therapeutic interaction to be predicted. Two, when therapists did not live up to the expectations to excuse me, what a terrible slip. When survivors did not live up to expectations to rise above hate and prejudice. For example, when they would say something like, I hate all Germans. Or three, when they became terrified of the extent of rage they anticipated or imagined in the survivors. Therapists' inability to cope effectively with the rage they experienced towards survivors and their children led some to reject them or shorten their therapies. They often justify their actions with reference to patients' resistance, which again appears to be a rationalization. Some therapists personally sought further therapy primarily to work through issues surrounding reawakened intense rage and related imagery. Indeed, in future webinars, we will speak about how therapists or other professionals should take care of themselves and must. But today we focus on this study. Let me continue to speak about shame and related emotions. Two criteria were used to categorize affective reactions related to shame. First, all have the common elements of humiliation and degradation. Second, all assume projective identification of the listener with the protagonist in Holocaust stories. Let me explain. Projective identification is when I project on you and identify with you, the protagonist, or with whoever, the Nazi or whoever was the protagonist. One aspect of shame is derived from therapist fantasies of what the survivors might have done in order to survive. Shame was also related to the therapist's disgust. Disgust and loathing frequently impelled the therapist to prohibit survivors and offspring from telling their stories. Shame was often related to therapist acceptance of the myth describing the behavior of the victim during the Holocaust as, quotes, going like sheep to the slaughter. This myth not only implies that they could have fought and that they should have been prepared for the Holocaust, but also assumes that Holocaust victims had nowhere to go if they chose to escape. Excuse me, had somewhere to go if they chose to accept, and that people wanted them. As historical evidence clearly indicates, there was no place to escape to because other countries failed to help or outright aided the Nazis. Therapists who accepted this myth tended to feel contemptuous toward and condemn survivors for having been victims, and as such weak, vulnerable, and abused. The process usually began with shame and contempt, and when therapists could no longer tolerate their shame, they became enraged. Therapists who indignantly expressed their contempt and rage consequently victimized their patients. Perhaps the deepest aspect of shame is what I have called the fourth narcissistic blow. Freud, in 1917, speculated about the reasons people rejected and avoided psychoanalysis, stating that Copernicus gave the cosmological blow to humanity's naive self-love or narcissism, when humankind learned that it was not the center of the universe. Darwin gave the biological blow, when he said that humanity's separation from and superiority to the animal kingdom is questionable. Freud claimed that he gave the psychological blow, by showing that the ego is not even master in its own house, and that indeed we have limits to our consciousness. I believe that Nazi Germany gave humanity the ethical blow, by shattering our naive belief that the world we live in is a just place in which human life is of value to be protected and respected. A country that was considered the most civilized and cultured in the Western world committed the greatest evils that humans have inflicted on humans, and thereby challenged the structure of morality, dignity, and human rights, as well as the values that define civilization. Not only therapists, but all of us, in various degrees of awareness, share this sense of shame. Indeed, this fourth narcissistic blow may have caused many in society to avoid confronting the Holocaust by refusing to listen to survivors and their offspring who bear witness to the experiences and its consequences. I hope while you're listening to me here, you're thinking of modern versions Although our four blows forced confrontation with essential truths about human existence, the ethical blow distinguishes itself by massively exposing the potential boundlessness of human evil and ugliness. Unless humanity is willing to integrate this historical narcissistic blow, the pessimistic prophecy stated by Freud in his Civilization and Discontent may be fulfilled. Again, think of today. Let me proceed to the next affective reaction, dread and horror. Other reactions that occur frequently among therapists are dread and horror. I dread being drawn into a vortex of such blackness that I never find clarity and may never recover my own stability, so I'm not going to be helpful to this patient. Therapists feel traumatized as if attacked by their own emotions and fantasies. They also reported horror in reaction to cathartic experience that survivors tend to relive with much vividness and intensity. Those therapists who attempted to control their own reactions were often drained by these sessions. A few found themselves sharing the nightmares of the survivors they were treating. One therapist reported experiencing herself, quote, tuning out to the point of fainting in reaction to her patients telling her about her own baby being smashed against a wall in front of her eyes, and about other children clinging to their parents' bodies in mass graves. This therapist stated that she was afraid to share this horror with her supervisor. Dread and horror were also reactions to the sense of total passivity and helplessness conveyed in Holocaust stories, which often led to the therapist to prevent recounting of any Holocaust experiences by using the various evasive and defensive maneuvers I described earlier. Let me move to a core response, which is grief and mourning, which also demands its own webinar. Therapists also reported experiencing deep sorrow and grief during and after sessions with survivors and their offspring, especially when losses and suffering were recounted. Some found themselves tearful or actually cried at those times. One therapist reported becoming progressively crushed to the ground with endless, bottomless sadness when constructing a family tree in an interview with a child of survivors. Having done his, quote, homework, the patient reported when, where, and how each of the 72 family members had perished, leaving only 2 survivors, his mother and father, whose children were killed before their parents' eyes after being torn from their arms. Some therapists attempted to avoid listening to pain and suffering by asking such questions as, how did you survive, instead of what happened to you? Or what did you go through during the war? Others spoke of sinking into despair and fearing to be, quote, engulfed by anguish. The anguish they experienced is related to the impossibility of adequately mourning so massive a catastrophe as the Holocaust. How can one ever mourn all of this? Most, if not all, survivors not only view the destruction of their own lives, their families and communities, but also 6 million anonymous graveless losses, and the total loss of meaning is the rightful context of mourning. Therapists who were unable to contain these powerful, intensely painful, yet appropriate feelings in themselves and in their patients, became intolerant or immobilized. They were therefore unable to provide, as you remember Winnicott's phrase, to provide a holding environment in which survivors and or their offspring could begin to grieve and mourn personal losses, a necessary healing process for them and their families. Another interesting reaction, including for all professionals, murder versus death. Two related phenomena, albeit more specific, are therapists or lawyers. Anyone use of the words death and dead as contrasted with mass murder and murder to describe the fate of the victims and or the deeds of the perpetrators of the Holocaust. Some of the participants to this study have been working with survivors of the Nazi Holocaust and with elderly and or the terminally ill, some of whom were also survivors, have used these words to differentiate between their reaction to personal, quotes, normal death and to the evils of mass murder and its anonymity in the Holocaust. We can think of many other current examples. COVID, war, you name it. Therapists who work with members of survivors' families encounter individuals whom the Holocaust deprived of the normal cycle of generations and ages. The Holocaust also robbed them, and still does, of natural individual death and normal mourning. The use of the word death to describe the fate of the survivors' relatives, friends, and communities appear to be a defense against acknowledging murder as possibly the most crucial reality of the Holocaust. When we continue the training in the future, we will focus on what each one of us brings into the relationship before even hearing a survivor. So one of those reactions is that of victim liberator. Therapists may view survivors as either victims or heroes. When they view survivors as victims, they are seen as fragile, helpless martyrs. This image generates bystanders' guilt, rage, and shame in the therapist. Ramifications of these reactions were already considered earlier. In the context of viewing the survivors as a victim, therapists reported another response that I have labeled therapist as liberator savior. When therapists perceive the survivor as if still living in the camps, passive and helpless, they became annoyed and impatient and felt the need to liberate them. This need stemmed from the therapist's intolerance of the patient's survivor's guilt, resulting in negative therapeutic reactions. Sorry, this is a bit technical term. You'll understand later. Negative therapeutic reaction is when a patient doesn't progress, right? In fact, goes backwards. Therapists reported feeling frustrated, angry, and unable to bear the patient's persistent suffering. As stated earlier, they generalized the view of survivors to their offspring. When they viewed the child of survivor as a victim, they tended to respond to the offspring as they did to the parents. Some therapists, however, viewed the offspring as victimized by the parents. These therapists attempted to rescue the children from their survivor parents, compete with the survivor parents, and or compensate for parental deprivation. Let me move to viewing the survivor as a hero. When therapists view survivors as heroes, they see them as superhumanly strong, capable, heroic fighters to be worshipped and admired. Some therapists were awed by the courage and hope and sheer determination reflected in Holocaust accounts. A sense of awe led some therapists to glorify the survivors, to conceive of them as special people who, having experienced ultimate evil and destructions, have found essential truths and meanings of life. Some researchers look for, quote, superior methods of coping in them, like acrobats of survival. Somebody asked me, have I met acrobats of survival? This, in addition to the historical distortion involved in such a view, also implied derogatory attitude toward the 6 million murdered. The main pitfall in overestimating the strength of survivors in therapy is the therapist's resulting insensitivity to the pain and suffering and the problems in living, which brought the survivors to therapy to begin with. The idealization of both victims and heroes may humble therapists and lead them to view problems and concerns in their own lives as trivial when compared to the survivors. Such attitude may result in envious and competitive feelings toward survivors and in feeling excluded or like an outsider. Some therapists who were not themselves Holocaust survivors or children of survivors reported feeling envious of the moral stature that has accrued to the survivors because of their suffering. Much like survivors' offspring, they reported feeling inferior to survivors because they believed that they would have never survived the situation described by the patients. Some therapists reported envying the fact that survivors' offspring are by definition members of a special group with its own identity, and they condemn the offspring for using their parents' suffering to claim their special status. They stated a preference for working with offspring of only one survivor parent, assuming that they will share better cultural rapport. They're more American. Most therapists generally preferred working with heroes to working with victims. One therapist reported wishing to hear heroic stories and turning off when his patients, quote, kept complaining. Most therapists also stated that they would rather lead offspring groups than groups of survivors because, quotes, hearing the stories secondhand is easier. Let me move to another reaction, again common, privileged voyeurism. Privileged voyeurism, in contrast to the reactions described previously, tends to lead therapists and researchers to dwell excessively on the Holocaust. Indeed, some professionals reported feeling privileged to work with survivors. One therapist reported feeling excitement, glamour, and an extra quality of titillation. Therapist sadism appears to be a major factor in many such reactions. Another therapist chose to treat survivors as a way to learn and understand his own family history and behavior. These therapists tended to become totally engrossed with the Holocaust and asked numerous questions, many of which may not have been relevant to the particular survivors' war experiences. Because of their zeal, they sometimes totally ignore their patients' present life situation, including their experiences following liberations. Similarly, they tended to neglect patients' pre-war history. A major danger of privileged voyeurism is to neglect the survivor or child of survivor as a whole person. You can click in your mind that this might be similar for lawyers, similar for journalists, war journalists, etc. But you have to do particular study on them. I'm not trying to generalize. I'm just, sharing you the findings here. There's another reaction I call Me Too. A somewhat related reaction among psychotherapists and researchers is what I call a Me Too reaction, also stated as we are all survivors. Although this global attitude may stem from a sincere attempt on the therapist's part to empathize with his or her patient, I believe it poses a real danger of blurring distinctions among various degrees of kinds of survival experiences and the various conditions and degrees of trauma. Therapists who are neither survivors nor children of survivors of the Holocaust have claimed, I am a survivor myself, after having initially felt I had no right being here. I hadn't shared their experience. Many therapists who are survivors and or children of survivors used similarity of experiences in the service of empathy and understanding, which they reported to be helpful to their patient. However, it was sometimes used in the service of defense or was otherwise problematic. For example, the Me Too reactions that assumed sameness of experience sometimes took the form on the part of some of these therapists foreclosing remarks such as, I know what you mean. I'm a survivor or a child of survivors too. In our last webinars, I mentioned that one of the easiest way to shut somebody up is to say to them, I know exactly what you mean, which means you don't have to say anything anymore. The defensive Me Too response on the part of either group of psychotherapists may interact with the patient's own fears that sharing their traumata would lead to reliving them. As such, this reaction acts to perpetuate the conspiracy of silence rather than to aid the patient exploration of his or her own particular experiences. It ignores the uniqueness of both the Holocaust and the particular meaning and consequences these have for the survivors and or for the survivor's child as a unique human being. And a related reaction is sense of bond. Therapists who are survivors or children of survivors were uniformly convinced that they were better able to understand and help survivors and offspring because of their shared complex history and unique experiences, culture, language, and customs. For example, I was there. Nobody who wasn't there could really know what hunger was really like. Nobody knows what it's like to emerge out of hell, to only find out that every single person you know had perished from the face of the earth. Some acknowledge that partly I also wanted to help myself with my own issues, and I knew my peers, my quote cousins, are the right people to do it with. This sense of kinship and connectedness was often related to these therapists' stated need to reestablish their own extended families and sense of communities. Sharing Carmelli's belief that professional neutrality and detachment cannot be helpful in counseling survivors. Some participants in this study expressed conflict over maintaining professional roles and authority in working with, quotes, their people. Elsewhere, I pointed out that in addition to self-assertion, Assuming authority was also frightening because it was associated with the possibility of abusing one's power and acting like a Nazi, or of becoming ineffectual and inconsistent, like sometimes the parents. This proved to be an additional component of the conflict for psychotherapists who are children of survivors. Let me move to the last reaction revealed in the study, which also has such deep implications for Ukraine today and for so many others. Attention and attitude towards Jewish identity. But as I said, it could be any identity. Think your own. Several factors determine whether therapists encourage or even permit their patients to raise and explore unavoidable concerns about the meaning of being Jewish after the Holocaust and the establishment of the State of Israel. The first is whether therapists believe that cultural, political, and religious issues belong in therapy or in psychology in general. The second is their conscious and unconscious attitudes towards these issues in their own lives. Some participants in this study judged their patients as, quote, ethnocentric, for claiming that the Holocaust was a uniquely Jewish phenomenon. Others were clearly perturbed by the cultural self-hate, inferiority, and shame expressed by their patients. These psychotherapists needed survivors and children of survivors not only to be proud of their heritage and cultural identity, but also to reestablish continuity with and belongingness with the whole of Jewish history of culture, rather than define their identity and their relationship with the post-war world solely in response to the Holocaust. While time limitations don't allow a full review of the differences between survivor and children of survivor therapists and those who are not, it is important to note that they were independent of both the therapist's length of experience and the therapist's gender. So let me summarize in order of frequency the reactions revealed, and you can see it in on the PowerPoint. So the reactions revealed are: number one, various modes of defense against listening to Holocaust experiences and against therapists' inability to contain their intense emotional reactions. As you might recall, for example, numbing, denial, avoidance, distancing, clinging to professional role, reduction to method and or theory. Number two, affective, right? Emotional, affective reaction, such as bystander's guilt, rage with its variety of objects, dread and horror, shame and related emotions, for example, disgust and loathing, grief and mourning, me too, sense of bond, privileged voyeurism. And three, specific relational context issues, such as parent-child relationship, victim-liberator, viewing the survivors as heroes, and attention and attitude toward Jewish identity. Let me conclude by reviewing the implication for necessary training. Traditional training in all of our professions generally does not prepare professionals to deal with massive trauma and its long-term effects. One psychotherapist stated, I think the biggest problem is not having any guidelines to deal with the Holocaust. The fear is of going into uncharted territory where your only guide is your patient, and yet you are in the role of expert. Knowledge about the Holocaust or whatever trauma, right, greatly increases the therapist's ability to help survivors and offspring. Although information cannot do unconscious reactions, it does provide a frame of reference that helps the therapist know what to look for and what types of questions to ask. Knowledge of pre-Holocaust background is also important. This may include the characteristic and dynamics of the survivor's family of origin in pre-World War II European Jewish life in its heterogeneity, and two, demographic factors such as age, education, occupation, marital and social status of the survivor at the outset of the Holocaust, to cite but a few. These are of particular significance in understanding the survivors' families' post-Holocaust adaptation and helps reestablish continuity. Familiarity with the literature on the long-term psychological effects of the Holocaust on its survivors and their offspring helps in the same fashion. Nonetheless, mental health professionals or other professionals should guard against a simple grouping of individuals as survivors who are expected to exhibit the same survivor syndrome or the same PTSD, and the expectation that children of survivors will manifest also a single transmission child of survivor syndrome. Indeed, the heterogeneity of the responses to the Holocaust and post-Holocaust life experiences in families of survivors that I have demonstrated suggests the need to match appropriate intervention to particular form of reactions if optimal therapeutic or preventive benefits are to be obtained. Many of the countertransference phenomena examined in the study were found in reactions to patients' Holocaust stories rather than to their behavior. The unusual uniformity of psychotherapists' reactions suggests that they are in response to the Holocaust. The one fact that the otherwise different patients have in common. Because the Holocaust seems to be the source of these reactions, I suggested, still suggest, that it is appropriate to name them countertransference reaction to the Holocaust or the trauma events, rather than to the patients themselves, and noted their similarity to alexithymia and hedonia and their concomitants and components, which in fact characterizes survivors. Extending the term to reflect therapists' difficulties in treating other victim survivors' populations may similarly have their roots in the nature of their victimization. I suggest the term event countertransference. Indeed, the themes reported by psychotherapists and researchers were also observed among other professionals interfacing with victim survivors of trauma, such as first responders, law enforcement and safety, emergency and hospital personnel, media, investigators, clergy, lawyers and judges, translators and stenographers, to name but a few. In their interaction with survivors and their children's stories, who may suffer similar legacies or with the survivors themselves. I believe that these feelings and attitudes may have contributed, at least in part, to the long-term conspiracy of silence between the Holocaust and other survivors and society. I hope that increased awareness of these reactions revealed in this study and of the different patterns of their frequency will assist therapists and investigators to contain and use them preventively and therapeutically, and provide a framework for systematic investigations of reactions to all suffering populations. In fact, raising that capacity is what I believe will result in genuine objectivity. Specialized trainings that include awareness and containment of the reaction will enable professionals not only to be fully present and objective in their interactions with victim survivors, but also use them for reparatively and preventively work for them. It's absolutely urgent. We must ensure that current victim survivors and succeeding generation will not continue to feel bitter and hopeless about receiving the right kind of help and attention. Many, if not all, victims of survivors often ache with the truth, and they alone are the master expert of their experiences. To my fellow professionals, I say, let us not deafen ourselves and thereby belie our own expertise. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Daniele, for your brilliant, so accurate presentation, and for all of your experience you shared with our audience for today, on previous seminars and webinars, and also, I hope, on our future trainings and webinars. So on, we're in discussions, and we have also our discussant on the floor, Mr. Belousov. I know we have few questions in our Q&A session, and if you don't mind, I will pass them after Yuri's presentation, because we have a limitation of time, because we are still on our work and so on. It's a great, it's something very surrealistic to know about these lessons of history, about Holocaust, and still we see our mass atrocities in Ukraine. We still have our ongoing full-scale military invasion of Russia Federation. We see crimes against humanity, we see tortures. So, when you told us about this case of a client who had such an experience as to be a collector of corpse, one of our freshest case of our clients, he also had such an experience just 1 year ago. So it's awful and it's something unrealistic, but it's our day-to-day reality in Ukraine. And I want to present to the audience Mr. Yuri Belousov. He is the head of Department of Prosecuting of War Crimes in Prosecutor General Office. Mr. Belousov has also background as an establisher of national preventive mechanism in cases of prevention of tortures in prisons, jails, and other places of detention. So I will pass the floor to Mr. Belousov, and for the beginning, I want to ask, because we as professionals of criminal justice, we have another side of this problem. We have to ask more and more about trauma in our interviews and criminal proceedings. We have to know all the details, you know, to prove and to build our cases. So, Yuri, in your day-to-day activity, what do you have with cases of trauma? How you avoid this re-traumatization? And what you could tell us about your issues and your challenges? Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. First of all, let me thank Yale for such a tremendous presentation, and really, I do understand how deep you are in the problem, how deep you are in the context, and how far we are from such a deep understanding of the challenges that you work with and the expertise you have in. And thank you so much, Yale, for this. And dear colleagues, I don't have such an expertise exactly in this specific sphere. We mostly are facing the results of trauma in our investigations. And, by this morning in Ukraine for the last 2 years, there were registered 121,000 war crimes. Broadly speaking, actually, I never thought about myself like this unless I heard at one presentation and the prosecutor general said that all Ukrainians are victims of war. And I started to think that potentially and really we are all touched by the war in a broad sense. So we are all in different, scale are really victims of war. But among us, there are people who are much, much more deeply traumatized by this war. And these relatives whose loved ones been killed, and we have this information on daily basis because every day we have new attacks, new drones, new rockets coming to our houses and killing our neighbors and our relatives and our loved ones. Sure, we have thousands of people who survived in Russian controlled places of detention or who are still there. And these places of detention, great deal of them really sounds like the concentration camps which Yale in her presentation described, because we really see in this 21st century that these camps exist, where you all heard about our guys who've been prisoners of war, who've been killed in Alenivka prison. More than 50 people were just burned down in that prison. And unfortunately, on daily basis, we got the information about tortures and killings of our civilians and prisoners of war in such places. Sure, we have thousands victims of torture and sexual violence in Ukraine, and we still get on daily basis the information about such cases on the territories which Ukrainian government doesn't control at the moment. And all these challenges or all these facts, they make a significant challenge to the Ukrainian criminal justice system. Because our criminal justice system was not ready for such a challenge. We never work with such a huge number of people who've been seriously traumatized. We were not trained how to talk to them. We were not trained how to not to cause additional trauma to these people. And we didn't know where to readdress these people. And maybe finally, we didn't know how to protect ourselves from the traumatic effect which, these terrible stories cause to our prosecutors and investigators. I heard from the Yale presentation that even specialists, the doctors or psychologists, even they, in their work, the people who've been specifically trained, even they could cause trauma or they could demonstrate improper treatment and behavior towards the survivors and victims. But sure, prosecutors who are not being trained on that, and investigators, one of the main tasks is to get the information about the crime, to find who committed this, and to find this person to prosecute him or her for such a behavior. And pretty often we have just one evidence on that event, and this evidence is a statement of the victim. And the more details victims would provide, the more chances we have for the justice to happen. And if you'd not been trained, so you would interview this, and actually pretty often when we start interviewing, this person already been interviewed by many times, whether by journalists or our partners from non-state organizations, for example, who did it in a good sake. They wanted to get the information, they wanted to document war crimes, and then we investigators interview, then prosecutors could be, then the person should repeat this story for several times in the court. And in the fact that the criminal justice and the way it operates pretty often causes additional challenges and problems for these people. Even we don't, the system doesn't do it deliberately. It's like a side effect because the system doesn't know how to work with these people. Another challenge that Ukraine is still unfortunately has, but fortunately that we have some changes, I would talk about that later, it still didn't turn, the criminal justice system didn't fully turn to the victim. It's still focusing on the suspect. We still, mentally, we need to find who did it. We need to find who did it, to find this person, and to bring him or her to the court. And pretty often, victims are staying aside, and they gave this information and they stayed alone. And for many, many years in Ukraine, there was no system what to do with these people. And they stayed on their own, and they, in this nightmare, which happens for them on a daily basis when they try to recall, or during the night, when these terrible memories are coming back to them. And I'm really glad that the situation starts to slightly change. Here, and Veronica represents the head of this coordination center for supports of victims and witnesses. It's a first in Ukrainian story when the law enforcement has a specialized center to support victims and witnesses at the moment of war crimes, but definitely the idea is wider to support all victims of violent crimes in the future. We have already, fortunately, in Ukraine, state and non-state. First, it was non-state as usual. Non-state actors are always ahead. Non-state, but already governmental institutions which work with deep trauma, which work with people who survived torture and people who've been deprived of the liberty, victims of sexual violence. And now these institutions, sometimes it's mixed combination of state and non-governmental institutions who've been already trained in Western countries how to deal with such people. And now all of our people who've been released from these camps, they undergo this rehabilitation process, and it's extremely, extremely important. Definitely, there are some legislation changes and some amendments are on the way, and which is also extremely important that our prosecutors and investigators started to undergo specialized trainings on that, how to do that. The basic is we started to introduce investigative interviewing approach, which is totally different from confession-based, approach, but there are some specialized training which our colleagues are undergoing. But it's still so much needed to be done. Still so much needed to be done. We're just in very, very beginning. We're just in the beginning of our step on our way. And I'm really, by saying that, I'm extremely appreciate that they all help, which is we have been provided by our partners who survived these stories before, who passed this way, and who know how many mistakes on this way, and who know how to overcome these mistakes, and who have enough expertise to provide to us. And I really believe this on our way. So for us, it would be maybe a bit easier than the way that our colleague passed, because we really believe that with your help, so we would be able to deliver justice to victims as well, because they should be the priority number one. We definitely should fully focus on them, and we're trying to do that. We're trying to shift mindset of our prosecutors and investigators that even if you didn't find, sometimes you couldn't find the perpetrator. Sometimes, especially in the wartime, some of them already been killed. Maybe we would never find them. But if you don't pay attention to the victim would never get the justice. That's why we really on this way, and I really be open. We are ready to cooperate with anyone who have expertise and willingness to help us. And I really believe that we would be more effective and our work would be in accordance with the best standards in this sphere. Thank you so much. Would be ready to answer any questions if you have. Thanks.
Yuri, I know that because of curfew, you have to leave early, which breaks my heart. I would have spoken quicker had I known.
Don't worry, you have much more expertise than I do. That's why.
But
We're just glad to get you.
But it's not the last time. I just want to quickly remind you of two things. The victim declaration and the resolution on reparations for victims both define victims as regardless of whether the perpetrator was identified or caught. I'm rephrasing, even though I participated in writing it. So in that sense, yeah, we can actually, we can work together to creatively help victims with or without quotes a case in the strict meaning of the sense. But that again, that's another webinar, right? It's like, how do we? This is all very complex. So that actually, I'm so glad that we that you brought that up, and that we included that phrase in the definition of victim, because yeah, I can't tell you how much we look forward to working together. It's to simply continue. And I want to tell the audience that the Hebrew meaning of the name Uri is my light. So, and Uri, and this Uri totally lives up to that. So
thanks so much. Yes, thanks so much.
So we will change his name in our notebooks, of course. And dear colleagues, if you don't mind, I want to share one of the questions from our Q&A session. And it's a great question as for me. So it's a question from Ms. Erika. In your opinion, would skills and expertise in trauma by one crime, for example, sexual violence, translate to providing the same assistance to victims of other crimes as living in a war zone, torture, etc.? Yael, Yuri, what do you think about it, and what experience you could share with us?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the exact question. Say that again. I'm sorry. I was thinking about. Sorry, yes. I was thinking about what Yuri was saying. Go ahead.
I just read it from our Q&A chat. So, okay. In your opinion, would skills and expertise in trauma by one crime, for example, sexual violence, translate to providing the same assistance to victims of other crimes, like living in a war zone or tortures? So, it's a question for both of you, to Yael and Yuri. So do we need to have specialization as for prosecutors, so for experts in psychology to deal with different kinds of trauma?
Yuri, you start.
Definitely we need. We at the moment, how we work, we at the moment are in the process of designing some policies and studying the best experience, but we already need to interview. We already need to interview our prisoners of war and civilians being released. We need to get the information from them. So at the moment, we fully rely on our partners, national, non-government and state, who first talk to these guys. And just when they tell us that they are ready to give a statement, we step in. And so at the moment, we are not specialized in conducting interview of traumatic persons. We have just agreed on some basic trainings. Our colleagues, we have a special division, which I need to mention, which works with sexual violence cases. They were maybe the first in changing this approach, and they undergone some specialized training how to deal with victims of sexual violence. The rest prosecutors who mostly talk to people who survived in torture and survived in these concentration camps, we do it together with psychologists. And this person who help us not to make a harm, if I could say in this. But as to the specialization, definitely, from my background, from my perspective, people who interview traumatized people, I mean, investigators and prosecutors, definitely need to have a specialization on that, because otherwise, we could harm the person.
So, and also it's another question from Q&A. How do you contend with people whose stance is nothing happened to me? I escaped. I myself didn't witness any atrocities. Anything that happened to me pales in comparison. How do you listen to them?
Who are you? Who is I'm looking at the chat. Could you just...
And also we have on the beginning of our page Q&A chapter.
Okay, who is the person?
It's a question. It's a question from Mr. Philip K.
Okay, and who is asking?
For both of you.
Okay. So let me just remind the participants that we already had 2 webinars. This is the 3rd webinar in a series, right? The first webinar gave general, as we said at the introduction, it gave general introductions to how we think of reparative justice, or justice as reparative, that holds victims and it centers victims' experience and victims' rights at its heart. And the second one was on different populations, indeed, that the Ukraine would or has already experienced in this horrible war. So some of you might want to review those 2. They are on our website. Now, as Yuri said, they have different offices for different victims because they need expertise and specializations. So this is that's the first step, of course. But I'm wondering, there's a question from Irina, right? Do you read it too, Veronica? I'm looking, because I don't know which one you're looking. Oh, you're looking at the questions.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm looking at... I was trying to be smart and I looked at the chat. Okay, so there's one from Irina Frankova. Are you looking at the same thing?
Yes, okay, you're right. We have this special chapter for questions.
So Irina is asking me, is the prevention of secondary traumatization actually possible if investigators are called to collect evidence and must ask questions about the painful experiences? What would be your recommendation how to address emotions that appear as a reaction to the questioning? This is why we are doing this training very methodically, We can't do all of it in one webinar because we would be participating in the conspiracy of silence and pretend like it's so easy. But let me respect the question nonetheless. I don't know that we can prevent what Irina means by secondary traumatization is she's acknowledging that the therapist is traumatized by listening to victim stories. Can it be prevented in the sense of can we respond if we and not be affected? That would make us inhuman. So it can't be prevented because when we listen to horrible story, we feel horrible about it. It makes perfect sense. The issue is how to learn to identify the emotions, to learn how internally we experience them, also how to contain the intensity of the emotions because they can deafen us and blind us. Even in the language, we speak about being blinded by rage, right? So the language tells us the same thing. So it takes training, actually, and it takes the process of training. And it is when we are able to identify the emotions and train ourselves to contain them, to embrace them and contain them, that we can truly add the information we gain from these emotions to make ourselves truly objective. And much wiser people, I can promise you. Now, Irina, do you have my principles of self-healing? I'm sure you do, if you can put them on the chat for everybody. But we will have a special webinar on just that. But beyond the special webinars, we are blessed that we can speak across the oceans. Much of this must be done in person. So we are working on actually coming to Ukraine or coming to Israel or wherever to work with people because it involves a process of growing. We can do it very fast. Thank you, Irina. Those of you who are interested, read in the chat. You have what I wrote about principles of self-healing. But again, it's one page. I like to do things organized, but it doesn't come quick. So I hope I answer some of it. So it is human to respond to horror. If we chose not to be human, we should not work with human beings. But it takes training. And there's no easy, quick way to do it, I'm afraid. There is a way, but no quick way. My prayer is that law schools, that all professions that work with human beings would take this training in law school, in medical school, actually in their original professional training. So thanks, Irina, for asking the question. There's Erica. Would skill and expertise in trauma by one crime translate to providing the same assistance? No. In general, yes, but you cannot pretend like all crimes are the same. They touch different dimensions in one's being. So again, all of this has to do with methodical, gentle training. The principles, yes, but not the specifics, I'm afraid. How do you contend, Philip K., how do you contend with people whose stance is nothing happened to me, I escaped, I myself didn't witness any atrocity, anything that happened to me pays in comparison? Yeah. Yuri, how would you deal with that? I will answer next. Veronica, you are the head of the victims unit. You can answer too.
Okay.
No. You know,
I readdress it to Veronica. No. Okay. Let me say a couple of words. So,
mechanism in action, yes.
That's a really interesting question, because the issue of competences and the issue of the purpose you are talking to the person. Because really, we work as prosecutors. Our task, if the person tells us a story, the real story about the camp inside, and describes us in detail the torture which the person undergone, for us it's extremely important, all details and who did it, to describe the person, to give as much details as possible for us to identify him or her, then to find this person. But the more details we ask, the more trauma we could cause. Sure, if the person said that he or she is okay, they just been there, we could feel that the person could have a significant trauma, but we definitely wouldn't press, because that's important that we should work together with psychologists and psychiatrists who should, deal with this problem. We are not the ones, even if we feel that the person, is closed and doesn't want to tell us. But for us, the interview would be finished, Then we could work with psychologists and maybe recommend this person, a psychologist, to pay some attention to this specific person, because in the context, this person spent some part of he or her life definitely traumatic. And such reactions show that this person is hiding this trauma inside. But again, we are not the ones who should deal with that. And that's maybe would be my answer. Brilliant.
Let me add to it that actually I have described this kind of reaction. You can listen to prior webinars when I spoke about survivors' adaptational styles, and I described their various adaptational styles. One, what I call the victim adaptational style, another, the fighter adaptational style, the third, numb adaptational style, and the fourth, in quotation marks, those who made it. This is those who made it, what you described. And they live on denial. The tragedy with that style is, while outwardly they may seem very successful and they may maintain a very single-minded, successful career or commitment, internally they have a rather tragic lives, very similar to the numb style. Now, I'm saying this only to get you curious and interested in reading all about it. And again, there's no way to quickly figure out all of it. But there's a lot to learn. In our work, we have attended and studied these. So please come, go to the website, read the other, listen to the other webinars, and stay in touch with us. We will go more into it. Denial is very rough, but it's human. I was a bit too quick in my answer to Erica, saying no, one does not apply to another. It was really out of wanting to say we have to go deeply into each experience. Otherwise, we are just running on the surface. And then some of the qualities you believe will make a truly effective interviewer and advocate for victims of trauma, for both individuals. That's what we are learning to do in these series of webinars and training. Let me explain the thinking. First, we have the concepts, right? But the concepts of what happens, right? A lot of it is out there. And the difficulty is in taking them in and what we do inside with them, right? So there's action, reaction. There's also who are we? Who do I bring to this interview as an investigator? I'm a human being who has history, maybe of trauma, of my own trauma, maybe of my people's trauma. That has probably affected me. We have to also explore that. And as I said, that is the part that most importantly is to be done in person. I shudder a little bit of how much trauma work is done on Zoom because, and that relates also to Eva Hofmanska's question. Okay, you interviewed the person. What then? Excellent idea. You know, Eva, that I feel very strongly that we must be ethical. That when we open somebody up, it's not ethical to just let them bleed out there, right? So we have to also, this is what Yuri said, right? Send them to psychologists. We have to create a network of support that will be responsibly trained and available for the victims after they did their service to us and to society by sharing their experiences so that our society will have justice. So yes, this is a big, we are not talking about several ideas that just we exchanged. This is a big project. What kind of society do we want? Do we want a society that has justice or not? Do we want a society that acknowledges victimization, that acknowledges pain, that acknowledges the need for wisdom and the need for healing? So these are multidimensional challenges, and I don't want to collapse them all to one dimension and say, yeah, it's easily done. So your questions are brilliant in the sense of pointing to different dimensions for us to look at and think about. But there's a question.
Sorry, Yael, I will use my right as a moderator because we have this. Yes. Sorry, we have this time limitation, and also we have this limitation in Ukrainian circumstances because Yuri, he is also want to go home sometimes, maybe. But I also want to answer on this question about what to do after interview. For this reason, our coordination center was established as a first point of referral mechanism of long-term support for victims and witnesses of war crimes. And we will be glad to cooperate with Sunflowers Project in this area, because now we are also on the stage of mapping of psychological services and psychological network of such for such kind of support. So it's a great opportunity, and you know, it's a great platform for us on this webinar to tell more to each other about our issues. And I'm glad to propose to conclude with last words for our presenters on today's webinar, because it's not a last webinar. It's a great series of webinar, and we will be glad to see our participants on the fourth, fifth, and other webinars. So, Dr. Daniele, the floor is yours for your last concluding words.
So first of all, I must repeat again that it's a total pleasure to be with you in the same webinar. And my last words are exactly what you said. We began to open the door to the right path, the right respectful path to build a democratic society on the principles of justice and heal the wounds of the victims, which are really the wounds of the society. Justice is one of the important lanes on that path. This is a process. We've begun it very seriously and very respectfully, and we will continue in that way. And from my heart, and you know, I dress to the right colors too. From my heart, I hope that the work we are doing together with Ukraine, humbly, will become a beacon of how to do the right kind of work.
Thank you for your support, for your commitment, and for all our future cooperation. And Mr. Belousov, we will ask you for a few words on the end of our webinar.
Last year I've been to the big conference where there were 200 of survivors of different types of war crimes. And one lady came up to me and she asked me about our work. And I said absolutely frankly that pretty often we don't come to you because we didn't find who did it, and we don't know what to tell you. We have been afraid that we would come and you would say, and who did it? We say, we don't know. We are trying to find, but we don't know who did it. And she answered, but for us as victims, as survivors, it's important to know that you're taking care about our case. Even if you didn't find who did it, but you didn't forget about this case. And for me, it was like a shift of my mindset. I understood that we shouldn't wait 2-3 years when we would find who did it. We should talk to people, we should inform them that we are taking care about these cases, that we are working for them. And since that, we started to try to change, our work in our department as well. But we need help. We need your expertise to do our work better, because we just don't have time, to with all this huge volume of cases we have. That's why I'm really sure that with your expertise and the expertise of colleagues being present here, we would make our work better. And I'm absolutely ready, and I'm sure that our prosecutors and investigators, a lot of them also are ready to change the way they do their job. And thank you so much for such webinars. For myself, I'm here not a presenter, I'm a participant also. I'm listening to what you say. I'm reading the question that colleagues are asking. And for me, it's extremely, extremely important to reassess the work I'm doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, dear. Veronica, do you give me permission as moderator to mention the next webinar?
Yes, of course, because promotion is all for us.
So very quickly, this is a separate webinar, not of this series, but very related to what's going on in Ukraine and many other places in the world. All of you will receive the flyer to our upcoming webinar, Observing the International Day of Mother Languages. That will take place on Thursday next week, 22 February at 1 at this time. And I know very much how Ukraine is resurrecting its own language and culture. And you would love that too. But and we will together plan the upcoming webinar on self-care of the therapist, perhaps. Everything we can do on Zoom. Otherwise, we work on making sure the in-person training.
So, dear participants, dear colleagues, Dr. Daniele, Mr. Belousov, you were great for today. And I hope we will be together in all our activities to help and to support our victims and our survivors. And together, we will have our victory in the nearest time.
Thanks so much, Unica, for a perfect presentation and moderation. All the best, colleagues. Be glad to see you all. Stay in touch. Yeah, bye. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Thank you, Veronica.